Hello everyone, what's up? In tonight's video I'll show you how I painted and weathered both these B2 Super Battle Droids and their bases. This is what the droids looked like after priming using AK Interactive black primer with microfiller. For the metallic base coat I wanted best results with maximum convenience, so I went for my current favorite metallic paint range, AK Extreme Metal. Anyways, as you can see, I am gradually building up opacity with successive passes with the airbrush, rather than laying it thick. Check out how fine the metallic pigments in this paint actually are. Even with this matte primer, which is kind of a handicap, the level of realism that you end up with is pretty amazing. If you want an even more reflective finish, just use AK Gloss Black primer instead. Most importantly perhaps, these enamel paints require no thinning, they're a joy to spray, and they also create a super realistic finish with no effort. The end result looks very good, if I may say so myself, and it just took me a couple of minutes per miniature. I followed this up with some stainless steel highlights. Now I have very little footage of this, I'm afraid, because I was sticking my head in front of the camera almost the whole time, but I hope that you get the idea. Essentially what I did was apply a thin layer of paint to the uppermost parts of each model. This is often called a zenithal highlight. This is what the droids looked like after this first step. As always, after base coating, I went for my trusty Tamiya X22 Clear, thinned 50% with lacquer thinner, and again airbrushed at around 20 psi with my Badger Patriot 105. This product, which is similar to a gloss varnish, is super easy to airbrush, never creates any frosting or other defects, dries completely in a matter of minutes, and it also creates the perfect foundation for our pin wash or for any other weathering effects later on. Essentially what I do is apply a thin coat first, and by the time that I'm done with the last model, the first one is already dry, so I can easily build up the clear coat gradually. By the way, with a larger model, like say a vehicle, I would do exactly the same thing, but rotating through different areas or panels instead. After a few passes, the droids were looking much shinier than before, and I knew the job was a good one. For the pin wash, I went with Ammo Black Wash, thinned around 30% with enamel thinner. The second paint well, as usual, is for me to clean my brush at regular intervals. Applying this wash is really child's play thanks to the clear coating. The wash flows into all the nooks and crannies through capillary action. This technique creates contrast immediately and is a joy to use. Any mistakes can be easily removed with enamel thinner, even hours and hours after application. This is what we call blending, and is one of the reasons why oil or enamel washes are so relaxing. There is zero risk involved. So here you can see what blending looks like. Quite simply, I use a brush, slightly dampened with thinner, not wet, to drag or push the wash where I want it. I'll have you know that I did this a full 24 hours after the pin wash. Now try that with an acrylic. And this is what the droids look like after the pin wash. The product you see me spray here is Tamiya LP5, which is a true lacquer paint thinned around 80% or more with Tamiya lacquer thinner. Like with these steel highlights before, this was really hard for me to capture on camera, but I hope this brief demonstration makes some sense. The reason that I use a lacquer for this is that it atomizes really well and really finely, even when diluted 80% or more, as is the case here, and even at low pressures. Besides, it's really transparent. The idea is to increase contrast by adding areas of shading. I applied some of these to joints and other areas where oil or some kind of dirt might deposit, but ultimately I just wanted the model to look more striking. By the way, a good alternative to this lacquer paint is the aptly named range of shaders by Ammovmig, which are a great acrylic option. And here are the droids after this step. Okay, time for some basing now. Unlike with the droids, I'm not using a dedicated primer, but instead just a very tough undercoat, which our chipping later will reveal. If you've seen my ATST or TX225 videos, then you know that this is a favorite mix of mine. You can check those for more details. Anyway, as you can see, this dark brown paint airbrushes beautifully, but as always, I'm cautiously applying it in thin coats until the finish is completely opaque. This paint will dry in no time, and it will also provide a very tough foundation, even though it's theoretically not a primer. Many scale modelers call this a chipping layer, as it is a layer of paint that the chipping will reveal later on. Since what I wanted to represent was an abandoned battle station or factory, it made sense for me to pick a dark tone emulating rust. And this is the first base now undercoated. Moving on. Time for some chipping fluid. This product can be applied straight out of the bottle, and you could aim it at specific parts of a model. But in this case I was rather indiscriminate, shall I say. If you use water-based paints for the base coat, which I will not, avoid flooding the bases as much as I am here. As you can see, there's really no secret to this though. If you don't own an airbrush, you can still achieve similar results with just a can of hairspray. So, Tamiya paints again, but this time with AK Interactive High Compatibility Thinner. Unlike my usual Tamiya thinner, this does react with chipping fluid, but it does so in a very slow and controlled manner. I applied this German gray at around 20 psi, building up opacity gradually as always. Not having to worry about dry tip at all, I could relax and enjoy the gradual shift from dark brown to gray. When I was done, I added some thinner to my cup and then some white paint, mixed this really well, and used this mix to add some highlights to the bases. Time to activate the chipping fluid. I started by applying some water to the main surface details on the base, but then I kind of changed my mind and applied it all over the surface quite liberally. As I said before, this paint and thinner combination is very slow to react, so I knew this was, well, relatively safe. Then I used a toothpick to make small incisions in the paint. The brush would come next and enlarge them and also create paint fading. Because of the kind of base coat that I went for, I could either keep the chipping under tight control or keep at it for a long time in order to get a dirtier look. Of course, you know me, I went with the latter. Bear in mind that the same amount of water and friction would have resulted in big flakes of paint coming off had I used acrylic products in the previous step. So, like everything, it depends on what you prefer. I've done it both ways, but for this project I wanted to have as much control as possible. By the way, if you want to avoid the undercoat contaminating the outer layer, as you can see here, just apply a varnish before the chipping fluid. In this case, I wanted to simulate rust, so that was part of the plan. When I was happy with the effect, I dried the base with the airbrush, and I was quite happy with the end result. For the bases, I decided to use the same wash that you saw me use earlier, so you know the drill. I also clear coated them prior, which is important in order to maximize capillary action. Initially I was really restrained and applied the wash with my usual really fine liner brush. As you can see, the wash flows very easily and the effect is quite subtle. In fact, if anything, the wash was maybe a little bit too subtle, so I kept adding little touches with a bit more product. In the end, I was quite happy with the result. However, for the second and later bases, I decided to speed things up and avoid this excessive subtlety perhaps by switching to a much thicker brush. While this did result in some spilling, I wasn't too concerned, given that I knew that I could clean up those mistakes rather easily. For the pigments, I decided to go with my favorite rust pigment trinity: track rust, medium rust and light rust by Ammo-of-Mick. Before applying the pigments, however, I let the wash dry for around 6 hours, and then I applied the pigments directly without any varnishes in between. As you can see, first I sort of sprinkle the pigment on, and then I use stippling. This should have two effects. One, some of the pigments will result in the flat surfaces being tinted, and some will deposit in the recessed areas. Once I was happy, I removed the excess product with another brush and moved on to the next color. Now it was time for medium rust. I tried to apply a little bit less product this time, and again I stippled enthusiastically to make sure that some of it stuck. Otherwise, with the clear coat that I had applied before, all of it might be easily dislodged. Lastly, I applied some light rust, again trying not to use too much. For stippling, by the way, I find that short bristled makeup brushes are pretty great. The last stage is applying the pigment fixer, which again works by capillary action. After it was all dry, I waited for a few more hours and then applied a matte varnish. And these are the complete bases. So guys, here are all the completed B2 Super Battle Droids. You may notice that they have some additional touches, like the red lenses, or more importantly, some chipping effects. The latter I really wasn't able to capture well on camera, but I'll tell you my secret. I applied the chipping with my mechanical weathering method, that is to say, by actually scratching the paint with some pointy tweezers and a hobby knife. This was a fun project for me, and I'm really looking forward to the AAT Separatist tank that is coming next. As always, a big thank you to all of my Patreon subscribers who not only help me keep the lights on, but always support me when the going gets tough. Thank you all, and remember, keep it up and weather it out.